I never expected my job as a paramedic to put me at odds with my neighborhood's home owners association. But the moment I parked my ambulance in my driveway after a grueling 24-hour shift, I knew I was in for trouble when I spotted Deborah Maitland's sour expression through her living room window. My name is Gavin Xavier, and I've been a paramedic for nearly 15 years. I moved into the Oak Ridge Estates subdivision in Lexington, Kentucky about 8 months ago, attracted by the well-maintained properties, the decent schools for my son, and ironically the security of a gated community. After my divorce 3 years ago, I wanted stability for my 10-year-old boy, Matthew. What I didn't account for was the iron grip of the Oak Ridge Estates HOA, led by its president, Deborah Maitland. I was dead on my feet that Wednesday evening in May. We'd responded to a multi-vehicle accident on I-75, and I'd spent hours helping extract and stabilize victims. All I wanted was a shower and sleep. But as I trudged to my front door, the click-clack of Deborah's heels on the sidewalk behind me made my shoulders tense. "Mr. Xavier," she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "A word, please." I turned, forcing a polite expression. Deborah was in her early 50s with blonde hair cut into a perfect bob, wearing a pink cardigan despite the warm spring evening. Her thin lips were pressed into a disapproving line. "Evening, Mrs. Maitland," I said, trying to keep the exhaustion from my voice. She pointed a manicured finger at my ambulance. "That cannot stay here," I blinked. "Excuse me, your vehicle." The way she said it made it sound like I'd parked a garbage truck in the driveway. Commercial vehicles are prohibited in Oak Ridge Estates. It's clearly outlined in Section 7, Paragraph 3 of the covenant you signed when you purchased your home. I ran a hand through my hair. "Mrs. Maitland, I just finished a 24-hour shift. I'll be back at the station tomorrow evening. The ambulance will be gone by then." "It cannot stay overnight," she insisted. "It needs to be removed immediately." "Where exactly am I supposed to put it?" I asked, my patience wearing thin. She gave me a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "That's not the HOA's concern. You agreed to our rules when you moved in. No commercial vehicles in driveways or on the street." "It's an ambulance," I said, as if that might make a difference. "I save lives with it." "Rules are rules, Mr. Xavier." She pulled out her phone and took several pictures of my ambulance. "You have 1 hour to remove it, or you'll be fined $100 per day until it's gone." Before I could argue further, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking like a time bomb on the pavement. I stood there, too tired to even process what had just happened. My neighbor across the street, Victor Harris, was watering his immaculate lawn and gave me a sympathetic shrug. "Welcome to Deborah's kingdom," he called over. "She got me last month for having my garbage invisible from the street for more than 12 hours after collection." I sighed and went inside, where Matthew was working on homework at the kitchen table. My sister, Vanessa Graham, who watched him while I was on shift, was preparing dinner. "You look terrible," Vanessa said, stirring something that smelled amazing. "Thanks," I mumbled, dropping into a chair. "I just had a run-in with the HOA president about the ambulance." "Oh no," Vanessa grimaced. "What did the dragon lady say?" I explained the situation while Matthew listened with wide eyes. "But Dad, you're a paramedic. You help people," he protested. "I know, buddy, but apparently that doesn't matter to the HOA." Vanessa put a plate of pasta in front of me. "What are you going to do?" I checked my watch. It was nearly 7 p.m. and I was supposed to be back at the station tomorrow at 6 p.m. "I don't know. I'm too tired to drive it back to the station now." "Can you park it at my place?" Vanessa offered. "I'm just outside the HOA boundary." I considered it. Vanessa lived about 15 minutes away. "I'd have to drive back here in the morning to get my car. then back to your place tomorrow evening to get the ambulance for my shift. Better than paying $100 a day, she pointed out. I nodded, forcing myself to eat despite my fatigue. After dinner, I drove the ambulance to Vanessa's house, and she followed in her car to bring me back home. By the time I finally got to bed, it was after 10 p.m., and I was so tired I could barely think straight. The next morning, I woke to a text from Vanessa. Dragon Lady was walking by this morning, saw me leaving, asked if I was house-sitting for you. I said no, just dropping off something. Be careful, I think she's watching your place. Great. Just what I needed, HOA surveillance. After dropping Matthew at school, I had to get Vanessa to drive me to her place so I could pick up my personal car, which wasted a good hour of my day off. I spent the afternoon looking over the HOA covenant I'd signed when I bought the house. Sure enough, there it was in black and white. No commercial vehicles may be parked in driveways or on community streets overnight. I understood the rule to some extent. Nobody wanted moving trucks or construction equipment parked permanently in the neighborhood, but my situation was different. I was on call sometimes and needed quick access to the ambulance. It wasn't like I was running a business from my home. When I returned to work the next evening, I explained the situation to my supervisor, Frank. That's rough, he said, frowning. But I can't let you keep the rig at your house if the HOA forbids it. Too much liability if something happens. I get it, I said. I'll figure something out. For the next few weeks, I managed by either leaving the ambulance at the station and having my partner pick me up, or parking at Vanessa's when I needed to drive it home. It was inconvenient and ate into my already limited time with Matthew, but I didn't see another option. Then came the letter. It arrived exactly 3 weeks after my encounter with Deborah. An official notice from the Oak Ridge Estates, HOA, informing me that I had been fined $500 for repeated violations of the covenant regarding commercial vehicles. According to the letter, my ambulance had been spotted in my driveway 5 times in the past month. I was furious. I had only parked it there once, the evening Deborah confronted me. I immediately called the HOA office and left a message demanding to speak to someone about the erroneous fine. The next day, I received a call from Patricia Wells, the HOA secretary. "Mr. Xavier," she said, her voice syrupy sweet, "I understand you're disputing the fine for your vehicle violations." "I am," I said firmly. "I only parked my ambulance in my driveway once, the day Mrs. Maitland spoke to me about it. I've been careful to keep it off the property since then." "Well, we have photographic evidence of the ambulance in your driveway on May 15th, May 23rd, May 29th, June 2nd, and June 8th, she said. "That's impossible," I argued. "I've either left it at the station or at my sister's house outside the neighborhood." "The evidence speaks for itself, Mr. Xavier. The fine stands. If you wish to appeal, you'll need to attend the next HOA meeting on the 20th and present your case to the board." I hung up, seething. Someone was lying, and I was going to find out who. I asked my neighbors if they'd seen an ambulance in my driveway on the dates Patricia had mentioned. They all said no, but most seemed reluctant to get involved. The fear of Deborah's wrath was real in Oak Ridge Estates. Victor was the only one willing to speak freely. "Look, Gavin, between you and me, Deborah's been known to embellish violations when she takes a dislike to someone." "You're saying she's making it up?" I asked, incredulous. He shrugged. "I'm saying she's been known to take pictures of violations, then use them multiple times for multiple fines. Happened to the Johnsons last year with their kids' basketball hoop. 1 picture, 3 fines. "That's fraud," I said. "Good luck proving it," Victor replied. "She runs this place like a dictator, and most of the board is too scared to stand up to her." I decided to attend the HOA meeting on the 20th. In the meantime, I installed a security camera on my garage facing the driveway. If Deborah was going to claim my ambulance was there when it wasn't, I wanted evidence to the contrary. The HOA meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a modest building with a small pool behind it. About 30 homeowners attended, sitting in neat rows of folding chairs while the board sat at a table at the front. Deborah presided, flanked by Patricia and 3 other board members: Roger Tompkins, a retired accountant; Maria Vasquez, a local real estate agent; and Thomas Chen, who owned several restaurants in Lexington. I signed up to speak during the open forum, and when my name was called, I approached the microphone set up in the center aisle. "Good evening," I began. "I'm Gavin Xavier from 1247 Oak Ridge Lane. I'm here to appeal a fine I received for allegedly parking my ambulance in my driveway on multiple occasions." Deborah looked down at me over her reading glasses. "Mr. Xavier, we have photographic evidence of these violations." "I'd like to see this evidence," I said. "Because I have only parked my ambulance at my home once since moving in, on May 15th, when you personally spoke to me about it, Mrs. Maitland. Since then, I've either left it at the station or at my sister's house outside this neighborhood." Patricia slid a folder to Deborah, who opened it and removed 5 photographs. She held them up one by one. "May 15th, May 23rd, May 29th, June 2nd, and June 8th. Clear violations of our covenant." I stepped forward to look at the photos. They all showed my ambulance in my driveway, but something seemed off. I asked to examine them more closely, and Deborah reluctantly handed them over. Upon closer inspection, I noticed they were all taken at the same time of day with identical shadows. The position of the ambulance was exactly the same in each photo. Even more telling, in the background of each image was my neighbor's cherry tree in full bloom, which had only lasted about a week in mid-May before the petals fell. "These were all taken on the same day," I said, looking up at the board. "The cherry tree in the background was only in bloom for about a week in May. It's not possible that these photos were taken on the dates you claim." A murmur ran through the audience. Deborah's face flushed red. "That's preposterous," she snapped. "The dates are clearly marked on the images." "Digital timestamps can be altered," I pointed out, "and I have evidence of my own." I pulled out my phone and showed them my work schedule for the dates in question, as well as geo-tagged photos of my ambulance parked at the station and at Vanessa's house. I also had statements from my neighbors confirming they hadn't seen an ambulance at my property since mid-May. The other board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. Thomas Chen cleared his throat. "Mrs. Maitland, this evidence seems compelling," he said carefully. "Perhaps we should reconsider this fine." Deborah's eyes narrowed. "The rules about commercial vehicles are clear, Mr. Chen. Whether it was 1 violation or 5, Mr. Xavier was aware of our covenant and chose to disregard it. 1 violation warrants a warning, not a $500 fine," Maria Vasquez pointed out, "according to our own bylaws." The discussion continued for several minutes, with Deborah becoming increasingly defensive. Finally, the board voted 3-2 to rescind the fine, with only Deborah and Patricia voting to uphold it. I should have felt vindicated, but as I left the meeting, I knew this wasn't over. I had publicly embarrassed Deborah Maitland, and I suspected she wasn't the type to forget that. Sure enough, 2 days later, I received another notice from the HOA. This time, I was being cited for unauthorized landscaping modifications because I had planted a small vegetable garden in my backyard. The fine was $250. I checked the covenant again. There was nothing prohibiting vegetable gardens specifically, though there was a clause requiring approval for significant landscaping changes. My garden was hardly significant, just a small raised bed with tomatoes, peppers, and herbs that Matthew and I had planted together. When I called to dispute this fine, Patricia informed me that all landscaping changes required prior approval, regardless of size. When I asked to see where this was specified in the covenant, she directed me to the spirit of the rules rather than any specific language. It became clear that I was being targeted. The pattern was obvious. Deborah was trying to make my life so miserable that I would either pay up or move out. My neighbors were sympathetic, but afraid to get involved. Victor told me that another homeowner who had crossed Deborah had ended up with over $3,000 in fines before selling their home at a loss just to escape the harassment. I wasn't going to be driven out so easily. I began documenting everything, taking daily photos of my property to prove compliance with the rules. I installed more security cameras and kept detailed records of every interaction with the HOA. I also started researching HOA laws in Kentucky, looking for some way to fight back. The situation came to a head in late July, when I returned home from a shift to find a bright orange boot on my personal car, which was parked in my driveway. A note on the windshield informed me that my vehicle had been immobilized due to unpaid HOA fines and would only be released upon payment of all outstanding fines, plus a $150 removal fee. This was beyond ridiculous. I called the police non-emergency line to report the situation. An officer arrived about an hour later and examined the boot and the note. "I'm sorry, Mr. Xavier, but this is a civil matter," he explained. "The HOA has the right to enforce their rules according to the covenant you signed. If you believe they're acting improperly, you'll need to take it up with them or pursue legal action." I thanked him for his time, then called a locksmith. For $75, he removed the boot within minutes. I stored it in my garage as evidence and parked my car inside to prevent further tampering. The next day, I received a furious call from Deborah. "You had no right to remove that boot," she shouted. "That's HOA property, and you've now added theft to your violations." "I did not consent to having my vehicle immobilized on my own property," I replied calmly. "The boot is in my garage. You can pick it up anytime, though I'll need to see documentation proving the HOA's legal right to boot vehicles on private property." She sputtered in rage before hanging up. I expected another fine to arrive, but instead, I received something far worse. A notice of lien being placed on my home for unpaid HOA fines totaling $1,275. This was a serious escalation. A lien could affect my credit and make it impossible to sell my home without paying the disputed amount. I needed professional help. I consulted with a lawyer, Elizabeth Connor, who specialized in property disputes. After reviewing my documentation, she agreed to take my case. "This is textbook HOA harassment," she said. "Mrs. Maitland is clearly targeting you specifically, and several of these fines are for violations that aren't even clearly defined in the covenant you signed." Elizabeth sent a formal letter to the HOA board demanding removal of the lien, dismissal of all fines, and a cease and desist of all harassment. She cited multiple violations of Kentucky property law and threatened legal action if the situation wasn't resolved within 10 days. The response was swift. I received a certified letter from the HOA's attorney stating that the fines were valid, the lien would remain in place, and any legal action would be vigorously defended. The letter also warned that I would be responsible for the HOA's legal fees if I pursued an unsuccessful lawsuit. Elizabeth advised me that we had a strong case, but that litigation could be expensive and time-consuming. The reality is that HOAs often count on homeowners giving up because they can't afford a protracted legal battle, she explained. I was about to respond when I received an urgent call from the station. A massive pile-up on the interstate required all available paramedics. I had to go. The scene was chaos, over 20 vehicles involved, multiple injuries, and traffic backed up for miles. We worked for hours, stabilizing victims and coordinating with helicopters for the most critical cases. It was well after midnight when we finally cleared the scene. I was exhausted and covered in other people's blood. Frank, seeing my condition, told me to take my personal vehicle home and come back for my next shift. "The rig needs restocking anyway," he said. "Get some rest, Gavin. You did good work tonight." I was too tired to argue. I drove home, barely able to keep my eyes open. As I approached Oak Ridge Estates, I realized I would have to access through the emergency gate at the back of the subdivision, since the main gate would be closed at this hour. The emergency access road was a narrow lane that connected to the main subdivision roads, designed for fire trucks and ambulances to enter when the main gate was closed or blocked. It was marked with "No parking" and "Emergency vehicles only" signs, and was supposed to be accessible 24/7. But as I approached, I saw that someone had placed a chain across the entrance, secured with a padlock. A sign hanging from the chain read, "Access restricted, contact HOA for entry." I was too tired for this. I pulled over and called the emergency number listed for the HOA. After several rings, a groggy Patricia answered. "This is Gavin Xavier," I said. "I need the emergency access road opened immediately." "Mr. Xavier, it's nearly 1 a.m., she complained. "The emergency access road is closed overnight to prevent unauthorized entry." "I'm a paramedic returning from an emergency call," I explained, trying to remain calm. "I need to get home, and this road is supposed to be accessible at all times for emergency personnel." "Do you have a signed access form?" she asked. "A what?" "An emergency access approval form. All emergency personnel need to submit one to the HOA office during business hours to receive access codes." I took a deep breath. "Patricia, this is an emergency access road. By law, it can't be blocked. I need it open now." "I'm sorry, but without proper authorization, I can't help you. You'll need to use the main entrance or wait until morning." "The main entrance is closed at this hour," I reminded her. "Then I suggest you find alternative accommodation until morning," she replied and hung up. I sat in my car, fuming. This was beyond petty harassment. It was potentially dangerous. What if I had been transporting a patient? What if there was an actual emergency and fire trucks couldn't get through? I decided to take a closer look at the chain. It wasn't a heavy-duty security chain, just a standard hardware store variety with a basic padlock. In my work as a paramedic, I carried bolt cutters for situations where we needed to access locked areas during emergencies. I retrieved them from my trunk and cut through the chain. As I drove through, I made sure to document everything with my phone, taking photos of the illegal blockage and the warning sign. I also called the non-emergency police line to report the blocked emergency access. When I finally got home, I collapsed into bed, too exhausted to worry about the consequences of my actions. But I knew there would be consequences. Sure enough, the next morning brought a pounding on my door at 7 a.m. I opened it to find Deborah, Patricia, and a man I recognized as the HOA's maintenance worker. Behind them stood 2 police officers. "Officers, this is the man who vandalized HOA property last night," Deborah announced, pointing at me dramatically. We want him arrested for destruction of property and trespassing." The older officer, whose nameplate read Reynolds, looked at me with a neutral expression. "Sir, we received a complaint that you cut a security chain on private property last night. Is that accurate?" "I cut a chain that was illegally blocking an emergency access road," I corrected. "I'm a paramedic, and I was returning from an emergency call. The road is required by law to be accessible 24/7 for emergency vehicles." I showed them the photos I had taken, as well as my paramedic identification and work schedule. I also called the HOA emergency line before taking action, I added. "I was told the road would remain closed until morning, which is a direct violation of safety codes." The officers exchanged glances. "Mrs. Maitland," Officer Reynolds said, "is this an official emergency access road for the subdivision? It's HOA property," she insisted. "We have every right to secure it as we see fit." "That's not what I asked," Reynolds said patiently. "Is it designated as an emergency access route on the subdivision plans?" Deborah hesitated. "Yes, but then it can't be blocked," the younger officer interjected. "It's a violation of county fire codes to obstruct designated emergency access routes." "We've had problems with intruders using that road," Patricia argued. "We're just trying to protect our community." "By blocking emergency access?" I asked incredulously. "What happens if there's a fire or medical emergency at night?" Deborah glared at me. "People can call 911 like normal, and emergency vehicles can use the main entrance. And if the main entrance is blocked, or if there's an evacuation," I pressed. "That's why emergency access roads exist." Officer Reynolds nodded. "He's right, madam. Not only is blocking that road not a violation on Mr. Xavier's part, but it could be considered negligent on the HOA's part. I'd advise you to remove any barriers immediately." Deborah's face turned an alarming shade of red. "This is absurd. He destroyed HOA property. We paid good money for that chain and lock, and I'd be happy to reimburse you for it," I said. "But the road needs to remain open." The officers explained that they wouldn't be arresting me and suggested that the HOA consult with the fire marshal about proper emergency access procedures. Deborah and Patricia left in a huff, with Deborah muttering something about escalating this to the full board. Later that day, I received an email from the HOA with a $500 fine for vandalism of community property and another $1,000 fine for unauthorized use of emergency access road without proper clearance. I forwarded the email to Elizabeth with a message. "They're doubling down. Can we proceed with legal action now?" Her response was immediate. "Absolutely. This is getting ridiculous. Let's meet tomorrow to discuss strategy." But before we could meet, I received a certified letter that changed everything. It was from the county assessor's office, confirming property boundaries in response to an inquiry I hadn't made. Attached was a detailed map of Oak Ridge Estates showing lot lines, easements, and common areas. As I studied the map, something caught my eye. The emergency access road I had used was marked as Lot 87, a separate property from the HOA common areas. According to the assessor's records, Lot 87 was owned by Xavier, Gavin T. I was confused. I owned the emergency access road. How was that possible? I called the assessor's office, and after being transferred several times, I spoke with a property records specialist who confirmed that Lot 87, designated as an emergency access easement, was indeed registered in my name. It had been part of the purchase when I bought my house. This made no sense. I pulled out my closing documents and carefully went through them again. Sure enough, there it was in the property description. including Lot 87 Emergency Access Easement, as shown on Plat Book 43, page 17. I had completely missed this when signing the mountain of paperwork at closing. My real estate agent had mentioned something about an additional lot included with the property, but I had assumed it was just legal jargon for the small strip of land between my backyard and the community pond. I immediately called Elizabeth and explained the situation. "This changes everything," she said, excitement evident in her voice. "If you own that road, the HOA had no right to block it, fine you for using it, or demand any kind of authorization for access. They were trespassing on your property when they installed that chain." "But why would I own an emergency access road?" I asked, still bewildered. "It's not uncommon for developers to structure things oddly to satisfy zoning requirements," Elizabeth explained. "Sometimes they assign certain common elements to individual lots rather than to the HOA to avoid complicated permitting. The important thing is, you have significant leverage now." She advised me to have a professional survey done immediately to confirm the boundaries and to gather all documentation related to the property. In the meantime, she would prepare a formal response to the HOA's latest fines. I arranged for a survey, which confirmed what the county records showed. I was indeed the legal owner of the emergency access road. The surveyor marked the boundaries with official stakes and provided me with a certified survey showing the exact dimensions of Lot 87. Armed with this information, Elizabeth sent a strongly worded letter to the HOA board informing them that their actions constituted trespassing, harassment, and potentially criminal mischief for placing unauthorized barriers on my property. She demanded immediate removal of all fines, the lien on my home, and any future restrictions on the emergency access road. She also requested a formal apology and reimbursement for my legal fees and the survey costs. The response was silence for about 48 hours. Then I received a call from Thomas Chen. "Mr. Xavier," he began cautiously, "the board has received your attorney's letter regarding the emergency access road. We'd like to discuss this matter privately if possible." "I'm happy to meet," I replied, "but my attorney will need to be present." He agreed, and we arranged to meet the following evening at the community clubhouse. I arrived with Elizabeth to find the entire HOA board waiting, minus Deborah. "Where's Mrs. Maitland?" I asked as we sat down. The board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. "She's been temporarily relieved of her duties as president while we investigate certain irregularities in HOA operations," Thomas explained. "I'm acting as interim president for now." Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. "What kind of irregularities?" Maria Vasquez cleared her throat. "After receiving your letter, we conducted an internal review of recent HOA actions, particularly regarding Mr. Xavier's property. We found evidence of inappropriate targeting, falsified violation notices, and potentially fraudulent use of HOA funds." Roger Tompkins slid a folder across the table. "Mrs. Maitland has been using HOA resources to conduct what amounts to a personal vendetta against several homeowners who have crossed her, Mr. Xavier being the most recent. We've discovered that she's issued over $15,000 in questionable fines over the past year alone." I opened the folder to find copies of emails between Deborah and Patricia discussing ways to make that paramedic pay and drive him out of Oak Ridge. There were also financial records showing that fine money had been used for administrative expenses that couldn't be accounted for. "We owe you an apology, Mr. Xavier," Thomas said sincerely. "The board has voted unanimously to rescind all fines against you and remove the lien from your property. We'll also reimburse you for your legal fees and the survey costs, as requested. And the emergency access road, Elizabeth prompted. We acknowledge your ownership of Lot 87, Maria said. We were unaware of this arrangement until your letter brought it to our attention. The previous board apparently knew but didn't disclose this information properly in the HOA records. However, Thomas added, we would like to discuss a proper easement agreement to ensure emergency access is maintained for the safety of all residents. Elizabeth and I exchanged glances. That's reasonable, I said. I have no intention of restricting emergency access. That's what the road is for. We spent the next hour hammering out the details of an agreement. The HOA would maintain the road, including snow removal and repairs, at their expense. In return, I would grant a formal easement for emergency vehicles and resident evacuation if needed. The road would remain unblocked at all times, but signs would be posted clarifying its purpose and prohibiting regular traffic. What about Deborah? I asked as we wrapped up. What happens with her? The board members looked uncomfortable again. We've referred the financial discrepancies to the authorities, Roger said quietly. The questionable use of HOA funds may constitute embezzlement. Beyond that, she's been removed from the board permanently. I felt a twinge of sympathy despite everything she'd put me through. That seems appropriate, I said finally. As Elizabeth and I were leaving, Patricia approached me hesitantly. Mr. Xavier, she said, her usual confidence gone, I want to apologize for my role in all this. Deborah can be very persuasive, and I was afraid of losing my position if I stood up to her. I nodded, not quite ready to forgive but appreciating the gesture. Thank you for the apology. The next few weeks brought significant changes to Oak Ridge Estates. The HOA followed through on all our agreements, removing the fines and lien and reimbursing my expenses. Thomas Chen proved to be a fair and transparent president, instituting new procedures for issuing violations that required photographic evidence and board review before any fines could be levied. I learned from Victor that Deborah had been charged with misappropriation of HOA funds. After an audit revealed she had diverted over $30,000 to personal expenses over 3 years. She sold her house and moved away before the case went to trial, eventually accepting a plea deal that included restitution and probation. As for the emergency access road, we worked out a formal easement agreement that protected both my property rights and the community's need for emergency access. The road remained open, with new signs clearly marking it as emergency vehicles only private property with public safety easement. In an ironic twist, the fire marshal conducted an inspection of the subdivision following the controversy, and found several other safety violations that the HOA under Deborah had ignored. Fixing these issues became the new board's top priority, and Thomas often consulted with me on emergency preparedness matters given my experience as a paramedic. The ambulance issue that had started it all was resolved with a simple solution. The HOA created designated parking spaces near the clubhouse for emergency and service vehicles, allowing me and other first responders to park work vehicles when necessary. It was a common-sense compromise that should have been considered from the beginning. By fall, life in Oak Ridge Estates had become significantly more pleasant. I got to know my neighbors better, many of whom confessed they had been afraid to socialize too much under Deborah's reign for fear of being cited for excessive gatherings. Matthew thrived in the more relaxed atmosphere, making friends with neighborhood kids and riding his bike freely without fear of arbitrary, unauthorized recreational activity fines. One evening in October, As I was raking leaves in my front yard, Victor walked over with a six-pack of beer. "You've earned this," he said, handing me a bottle. "You know, when you moved in, I gave you 6 months before Deborah drove you out. Never thought you'd be the one to drive her out instead." I laughed. "That wasn't my intention. I just wanted to be treated fairly. Sometimes that's all it takes to change things, one person standing up." He raised his bottle in a toast to emergency access roads and the guy who accidentally owned one. We clinked bottles, and I looked around at the peaceful neighborhood as the sun set over the autumn trees. It wasn't perfect, but it was a home I had fought for and won the right to enjoy. A week later, I received a letter from the new HOA board. Inside was a certificate declaring me an honorary emergency consultant to Oak Ridge Estates and a complete waiver of my HOA dues for 1 year, in recognition of services to the community. It wasn't exactly how I'd planned to become involved in neighborhood governance, but I had to admit it felt good to be appreciated rather than targeted. And every time I drove past the emergency access road, I couldn't help but smile at the thought of Deborah's face when she learned I owned it. Sometimes, life's most surprising victories come from the battles we never intended to fight. In my case, it was a simple desire to park my ambulance at home after a long shift that led to uncovering corruption, building community, and finding my place in Oak Ridge Estates. Not a bad outcome for a paramedic who just wanted a good place to raise his son. As I pulled into my driveway that evening, ambulance and all, I noticed the new neighbors moving in across the street, into Deborah's old house. I waved and made a mental note to welcome them properly tomorrow. After all, that's what good neighbors do, especially ones who happen to own the emergency access road.